The Cold War was one of the defining aspects of the 20th century. From groundbreaking advances in technology, to shifting global allegiances, to the pervasive threat of nuclear hellfire, there's no shortage of excitement when it comes to this life-or-death struggle between two superpowers. However, one feature of the conflict often fades into the background: the effect that the Cold War had on decolonization efforts around the world. While fleets of nuclear submarines positioned themselves to strike, and spy planes surveilled enemy territory from the heavens, countless people and societies toiled to throw off the chains of colonialism and gain their own independence, oftentimes getting caught in Cold War crossfire in the process. In today's video project, we're going to examine the effects that the Cold War had on these struggles and the reasons behind them. Before the outbreak of World War II, the colonial empires, minus Germany, were still kicking. While various revolutions and the Monroe Doctrine had deprived Europe of many of their colonial possessions in the Americas, the majority of Africa and large parts of Asia were still controlled by various empires, namely the British and French, but also the Belgians, Dutch, and Portuguese. By the end of World War II, these nations had been weakened by years of fighting, destruction, and occupation. The moment was right for colonies to make a bid for independence. Some places, like Korea, had been wrested from their colonizers by the Allies during the war. Others, like the Philippines, were granted independence as soon as the hostilities ended. Many more, though, had to endure the chaotic and often violent process of decolonization during the Cold War, where the economic systems and political ideologies a leader chose could make or break the future of his country by alienating one or both superpowers. The Soviets tended to throw their weight behind countries that proclaimed socialist values, while the Americans resisted by propping up anti-communist governments around the globe. The first colonies to be granted independence in Africa were former Italian possessions that were seized during the African Campaign and placed under Allied control. After the war, the United Nations voted to create the United Kingdom of Libya as well as the Trust Territory of Somaliland, beginning the long process of decolonization that would sweep over the continent in the coming decades. Perhaps the most spectacular fight for independence came from Algeria, which rose up against France in 1954. The primary resistance faction, the FLN, attempted to win not only by destroying French assets in Algeria, but also by courting international favor in the UN and exploiting the tensions between NATO and the East. It frequently framed the presence of the French as detested among the native population, and secured US support by threatening to turn to the Soviets for war material. In a desperate attempt to hold on to Algeria, France relinquished control over its other African colonies, including Tunisia and Morocco. They would eventually lose even that, and the People's Democratic Republic of Algeria was born. The Angolan War of Independence, fought against Portugal, involved a complicated patchwork of insurgent groups sponsored by the likes of China, the United States, and the Soviet Union. This mass of rebel factions only grew once the Carnation Revolution took Portugal out of the fight and the so-called freedom fighters began to turn their guns on one another. The ensuing Angolan Civil War saw the US-backed FLNA and Chinese-backed UNITA go toe-to-toe with the Soviet-backed MPLA and thousands of Cuban army regulars. The war would last decades, and only officially end with the death of UNITA leadership in 2002. Another independence movement turned to bloodshed when Rhodesia declared its autonomy. It was soon attacked by communist-backed guerrilla groups, the ZANU and ZAPU. The West resisted these groups by giving military and financial aid to Rhodesia. South Africa offered its arsenal of locally manufactured weapons, and volunteers from the US and other Western countries joined to fight against the communists. Hostilities would end after 15 years and thousands of casualties, with the UN recognizing Zimbabwe. As we've seen from all of these examples, the greater politics of the Cold War often trump other allegiances and motivations. The US would support independence movements that are opposed to fellow NATO members, and the People's Republic of China sometimes oppose the proxy armies of their Soviet counterparts. There are some moments when the superpowers more or less ended up on the same side. One such instance was the Suez Canal crisis. No, not that one. Egypt and Sudan had been de facto possessions of the British Empire under the Anglo-Egyptian condominium until a coup led by Jamal Abdel Nasser left the country under his control. Nasser was a big proponent of Pan-Arabism and helped to supply and finance the FLN rebels in Algeria. He crossed a line, however, when he nationalized the Suez Canal and prohibited its use by Israeli vessels. Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt, but were stopped when the USSR threatened rocket attacks on the coalition for attacking its ally, and the US threatened economic sanctions on Britain for endangering the continued operation of the canal. This conflict, more than any, put the new status quo on full display for the world to see. The imperial powers of old were now subservient to the nuclear superpowers of the Cold War. Decolonization wasn't limited to Africa. Many areas of Central, East, and Southeast Asia had been colonized centuries prior to the Cold War, and just like their Western cousins, they wanted a taste of independence. The main player of the region at this time was China. China had been fighting a civil war since 1927, which was ultimately won by the Communists in 1949. This turn of events meant that the most powerful nation in East Asia would now support nearby socialist governments to expand its sphere of influence. And much of the decolonization in Asia led to wars fought with Chinese copies of Soviet weaponry. Korea was annexed by the Empire of Japan in 1910, and with Japan's defeat at the hands of the Allies, it was determined that the Korean peninsula would be split into a communist state and a non-communist state at the 38th parallel. Soon, North Korea attempted to invade and annex their southern neighbors, prompting a UN coalition led by the United States to join the fight and push the communist forces back into their own territory, which then prompted the People's Republic of China to get involved and push the front back down around the 38th parallel again. While Korea is now independent from Japan, it exists in an uneasy state of bifurcation to this day. Vietnam was part of French Indochina during World War II. When Paris fell and the Vichy government took over, Japan was allowed access to its waters in the Gulf of Tonkin. When France was liberated by the Allies, however, Japan was quick to depose the French colonial government and take Indochina for itself. When Japan was defeated, guerrilla forces including troops under Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam to be independent, but the French didn't see it that way. After fighting off France, Vietnam too was split into northern and southern states representing communism and anti-communism respectively. Border clashes ensued, and the US again found itself intervening in Asia to halt the spread of communism. Even after the Sino-Soviet split, North Vietnam was backed up by both the Chinese and the Soviets. And after several years of intense guerrilla warfare, the United States withdrew and allowed South Vietnam to fall to communism. Ho Chi Minh had been an admirer of the values espoused by America's founding fathers, and he had hoped that the US would see Vietnam as a reflection of its own history. However, this occurred during the Cold War, and any anti-colonialist priorities America had were trumped by its opposition to communism. Japan had taken over many of its neighbors during World War II, and the Dutch East Indies were no exception. After the war, Indonesia declared its independence, but, just like Vietnam, its previous colonial owners, in this case the Dutch, weren't having it. They attempted to retake the archipelago, but their military had been so devastated by the war that they had difficulty mustering a significant force. Meanwhile, the United States threatened to exclude the Netherlands from the Marshall Plan entirely if it didn't allow Indonesian autonomy. With their road to recovery in jeopardy, the Dutch backed off and Indonesia was recognized as independent in 1949. This time, because the looming threat of communism wasn't as present, the US defaulted to its policy of anti-colonialism. After a long campaign of peaceful protests and civil disobedience, India was granted its independence and was partitioned into India and the Muslim-majority Pakistan. India would later play a role in other decolonization efforts in Asia, including that of Indonesia. From the moment World War II ended and the Cold War began, countless colonies and overseas possessions scrambled to gain their independence. From its inception in 1945 to the end of the Cold War in 1991, the United Nations grew from 51 members to 166. The policies and attitudes of the superpowers and their aligned peers dictated the futures of these now independent nations, and for some, the choice would be fatal. All in all, decolonization played an important role in the Cold War, even if it isn't the most glamorous of topics. The sides picked and the choices made all those years ago shaped the world landscape that we know today.